Hi everyone, this is Frances from FKB Physio, and I'm wanting to do a little update about the best type of exercise for bone density. We've obviously covered this topic before, but as you can appreciate in healthcare, there's always new research coming out, and it's really important to stay on top of the research and sort of see where things are at. My opinions of the best type of exercise for bone density have changed in the last 5 years, and so I wanted to share kind of where things seem to be at with the research. What I've done is I basically picked a number of systematic reviews from the last 5 years. So they are papers that they basically collate all the available research on a topic and put it together and see if they can come up with any conclusions from that. And these are really good because they combine all the research together in theory. And so if you do have like a bunch of studies with small sample sizes, for example, they can like combine them together. And so you have a bigger sample size and you might be able to come up with a higher certainty of evidence about a certain topic. The issue often in healthcare though is that the interventions are different enough, or the people are different enough at baseline. So for example, one study's done on premenopausal women and the other study's done on postmenopausal women or something. They can't easily combine the people together, and so most of the systematic reviews that I looked at have kind of low certainty evidence, which is tricky but common in healthcare. So as I said, what I've done is I've got a bunch of those through different regions, like they were systematic reviews conducted in a number of different countries around the world that are recent. And I also got best practice guidelines for osteoporosis from Australia, Canada, and the UK. And I sort of like read all of them and then took the pieces of information that were consistent across those to kind of give an update as to the best type of exercise for bone health. And I think you can be pretty comfortable doing that the information is going to be the best we've got. As opposed to just looking up, say, like one study, like an individual study where they've looked at like one group of people and come up with a decision based on that. Systematic reviews are, at least, they combine lots of things together. Of course, they are subject to bias, just like anything, and I didn't really assess the quality of the systematic reviews at all. I just tried to get around it by looking at more than one, basically. So there are some consistent take-homes from each study. So what I'm going to do is just tell you what the take-homes are, and then you can decide to keep listening if you want after that. So the consistencies that are across all 4 systematic reviews that I looked at, and I mean, I've read a lot more than those 4, and sort of from reading widely on the topic, these things seem to be pretty consistent. So the first thing is that exercise is likely to have a positive impact on bone density, and therefore meeting exercise guidelines, which is a minimum of 150 minutes a week, is important. So that's sort of base level. Then in order to improve bone density, that's when things get a little bit more specific. And of course, once again, bear in mind that everyone is completely different. So you might meet someone who's never done any sort of formal exercise in their life and they have completely fine bone density. That's just the nature of being a human. So that doesn't disprove that there are types of exercise that are more likely to be beneficial for bone. It is correct that not everyone has to do this type of exercise, but if you're someone who wants to know what's the type of exercise that's most likely to help me, then this is what they've found by doing research. So if you want to try and improve bone density, it is likely that you'll need to do exercise that targets all major muscle groups so that the exercise can target the whole skeleton. It's likely that you'll need to do strength-based exercise that is hard and progressively harder over time. And I will go into what hard means in more detail later. That you should do this exercise a minimum of 2 to 3 times a week. And that a combination of exercise interventions is likely to be more beneficial than a sole intervention. So if we're saying resistance training is the most effective, it might be even more effective if you combine it with impact loading, like jumping type loading as well, or aerobic loading, like aerobic exercise, or often those two are sort of the same type of thing. So it might be more effective if you do both of those things. And they're less likely to be effective on their own. In particular, impact loading alone is less likely to be effective. And then the last thing is that balance training could be incorporated to reduce falls risk and should be in certain populations. but often the other interventions will cover balance, like if you're doing strength training that involves standing on one leg, or if you're doing jump training where you involve landing from a jump, you're likely to cover balance there, and so that counts. So the thing is that resistance training is a really effective way to load all your skeleton, to load all your major muscle groups, and to progressively overload over time. So progressive overload means that you need to make the exercises harder and harder. So you would know if you've done exercise before, once you've done the same weight at the same number of reps, eventually it does get easier. You need to either do more reps or up the weight. So things like yoga and Pilates, Tai Chi, they are strength-based. They are resistance-based, body weight resistance, or resistance with Pilates. If you go from doing no exercise at all to doing one of those things, that is likely to be like a significant enough change that it might improve your bone density in the initial phase, or it might reduce bone loss. The thing is that trying to keep progressing those things over time is likely to be hard. And you might progress, like say yoga, you might progress yoga by like holding a pose for longer or going into a deeper range of movement. And again, that is likely to have some effect. But in terms of what's the most effective thing, or what are you likely to be able to kind of keep doing consistently or have big impact with, it is likely to be resistance training, because you can do that progressive overload really effectively with that type of exercise. So looking at like what is the papers I'm using to back up what I'm saying. So before we go into that, just a little note on defining what low intensity and high intensity means in the context of resistance training. So high intensity resistance training does not mean high intensity exercise that you're probably thinking of like cardio. It means lifting weights that are super heavy for you. And heavy is really subjective, so I want to just define what that means. So basically, high intensity lifting of weights refers to weights that are about 80 to 85% of a person's 1 rep max. So that means a weight that a person could lift literally once and not twice. That is a 1 rep maximum. 80 to 85% of that weight is probably a weight you could lift 5 times, but no more. So that's called high intensity training. Lifting a weight that's between say 60 and 79% of your 1RM are weights that you might be able to lift more like 10 to 15 times. And low intensity are weights that are more like 40 to 60% of 1RM, and weights you might lift more like 20 to 30 times. But bear in mind, all of that is referring to weights that number, so like saying you could lift 30 times, it's saying that you'd fail at 30 reps. So even though there's low, moderate, and high intensity weightlifting talked about in the research, it doesn't mean that high intensity is hard and that low intensity is easy, because it's implying that the number of reps you're doing that weight at is the maximum number you could do. And so if you're lifting a weight 5 times and you couldn't lift it 6 times, that is a similar amount of hard work, let's say, in my opinion, to a weight you could lift 10 times but not 11. So a weight you could only lift 5 times is a high intensity workout. A weight you could only lift 10 times is a moderate intensity workout. But as the person performing those exercises, you're likely to feel like you're working super hard if you're taking them towards failure. And I actually think that if you're doing it at like 30 reps, it's going to burn heaps more and be a lot more uncomfortable, which is actually sort of talked about in some of the studies. But just bear that in mind, because I think it's important to note that while they're talking about low, moderate, high intensity lifting, it is implying, or it's assumed, that whatever kind of weight you're picking, you're taking it to a certain point that means it's hard for you. Okay, so the UK guidelines basically say that you need to do strength training 2 to 3 days a week that targets the whole body, in particular back extensor muscles. Make sure you don't not include those, like make sure you do include those. And you should work up to a maximum weight that can be lifted 8 to 12 times for 3 sets. And so again, it's saying that a weight you could only lift that many times. It's saying that you should meet those minimum exercise guidelines, and people should be encouraged to keep doing exercise they enjoy, but know that they need to prioritize that strength training if they're wanting to improve their bone density. It does mention impact exercise. So it suggests people doing moderate intensity impact loading, which is things like jumping, working up to about 50 reps a day, done in 5 lots of 10 efforts with low intensity exercise in between. For those people that aren't safe to do that, they can focus on low impact exercise like walking to meet those exercise guidelines. It recommends balance training. So, but mentions that for people that are doing those other types of exercise, it's likely to be covered. And it does recommend that the exercise should be tailored to the individual, and it's likely to be more beneficial if they work with like a healthcare professional who's trained in that area, especially if they've been diagnosed with osteoporosis. It sort of needs to be safe. So the Canadian guidelines are the same, although they're less specific. They don't go into sets and reps, and the impact loading is also fairly vague. But it is, again, really highlighted that the priority needs to be strength and balance exercises, and it should be done a minimum of 2 to 3 times per week. All of the guidelines recommend avoiding end of range loading of the spine if it's bent. So like bending all the way forward and doing it with load, rapidly twisting, twisting with load. Those are discouraged in all the guidelines. And the final one is the Australian guidelines, which are very similar to the British one. So in terms of the impact loading, they talk about that, but they're more specific in that they define moderate intensity loading, impact loading, as 2 to 4 times body weight, which is things like jumping. Or for people that can't manage that, they should try and do things that are less than 2 to 4 times body weight, which might be more like walking or stomping. And again, they go into who might be safe to try those exercises and who you'd need to be more careful with. They talk about accumulating a total of 3 hours of exercise a week of any type that challenges balance. And they, in their strength guidelines, they actually more so promote that high intensity lifting. So they recommend people lifting weights that they can only do for 5 to 8 repetitions on 2 to 3 days a week. Again, targeting the whole skeleton and making sure to include the lower back. So essentially, like I said at the start, the consistencies are that they all recommend strength training. They all recommend it 2 to 3 times a week. They mostly recommend including impact like jumping type exercise as well. And they all recommend doing a high amount of total exercise a week. The differences come in the specifics, where the Australian guidelines recommend higher intensity lifting, the British guidelines recommend moderate intensity lifting, and the Canadian guidelines don't mention it at all. So then looking at a few systematic reviews from the last 5 years. So the first one is Souza and colleagues in 2021. And this one's interesting because it basically challenges the idea that the Australian guidelines are built on, which is that you need to do high intensity lifting to improve your bone density. So the authors kind of make the point that the studies that say high intensity lifting is more effective than moderate intensity didn't directly compare those things. They did like high intensity compared to not much. And the studies that look at moderate intensity or even low intensity lifting show similar improvements to bone density, but they really stipulate that as long as the effort is matched. And so as long as the people are working towards failure, then the outcomes are going to be similar. And this is backed up by a study by Lazevicius, in 2022, looking at hypertrophy, so muscle growth. And they found that whether you lift high weights for low reps compared to low weights for high reps, as long as the effort is matched, like you take them to failure, they did in that study, you'll have a similar muscle growth effect. And they showed that if you lift like low weights but not to failure, you won't have a muscle growth effect. So it really showed you, as long as you're going towards failure, the effects are similar. It showed that if you're lifting heavy weights, you don't have to go to failure. So it sort of brings in those specifics saying, well, if you're going to lift heavy weights, you don't have to take them to failure to get stronger. Whereas if you're lifting light weights, you probably do have to take them, not stronger, to build muscle, which isn't the same as strength. It's different. It's saying if you want to build muscle, if you're lifting heavier weights, you don't have to take them to failure. if you're lifting lighter weights, you probably do have to take them to failure. It did mention in that study as well that the lower rep, heavier weights improve strength more so than the light weights. And it did mention that the challenge of exercising like this, where you lift light weights for so many reps until you fatigue completely, is quite uncomfortable, and a lot of people don't want to do it. But I guess what I take from the study is that as long as you're working really hard, you can make whatever rep range work, and you can work together with the patient or the client to figure out what suits them best. But it should be kind of working towards that really hard effort over time. And I guess I've just found in my own practice, naturally, on certain exercises, you're going to end up picking lower reps anyway. I don't know if you've ever tried taking a deadlift to near failure and doing it for 12 reps. It is way too hard, and much better to do lower reps for that exercise. And just as a side note, in this population, I pretty much avoid going to failure on any exercise anyway. Again, I feel like they really wouldn't like it, and it's probably not safe to do it if it's really heavy weights. So there's a happy medium in there somewhere, but I think, like I said, the take home is to work hard to improve your muscle mass, which in turn improves your bone density. Then there's Kitagawa in 2022. So this study confusingly said that high intensity resistance training and impact loading is more effective than moderate intensity. But the findings were very low certainty in nature. So they basically were saying all the studies are too different to really know for sure. And I guess a take home from this one was that they were saying that doing the exercise more often is likely to have more benefit. So 2 or 3 times a week is better than 1. So we can take that away from it. And it's still saying that resistance training and impact loading are likely to help. Impact loading wasn't mentioned in the earlier study that I just talked about. And Kitagawa talk about how the effects of resistance training and impact loading seem to be more effective at improving bone density in the lower back or the lumbar spine than in the hip, which is pretty consistent across the research. The next two are from 2025. So there's Al Nasser and colleagues in 2025. And essentially this one probably wasn't as detailed. It basically just looked at progressive exercise, like exercise that gets progressively harder over time. And it found that it really didn't matter what type of exercise it was. As long as it got harder over time, it can improve bone density. Again, that's great. So if you're a newbie to exercise, you could probably pick anything. But if you want to keep progressing it over years, if you're going to be doing bone density exercise for 30, 40, 50 years, trying to find something that you can progressively overload for all that time is likely to be important. And there's going to be certain types of exercise you can do that more easily for than others. And the last one is Zioa and colleagues in 2025. So this basically just looked at resistance training and aerobic training in postmenopausal women. And it found that you could improve bone density at both the lumbar spine and at the femoral neck, which is a bit different to most of the other research, which shows femoral neck is very hard to have an influence on. And this was most effective if you did resistance training combined with impact training or aerobic training. Resistance training alone was also effective, but it was made more effective if you did aerobic or impact exercise, which again, you can sort of take the other studies and put them together with this one and go, cool, if we're getting our people who are safe to do so doing like jumping, bounding, that type of exercise, it's likely to improve their overall results. And it's thought that this potentially has some sort of like other mechanisms that are outside of my wheelhouse to understand. Like it might have some like metabolic effects to do aerobic exercise that could be helping. So a major limitation to the research is that most of the studies are really short. Like none of them go for more than 2 years, which is really tricky because bone changes very slowly. And so it's really hard to kind of know, like, okay, what does this look like over time? If someone's been strength training for 10 years and they're sort of not really progressing their weights, what happens then? Like, is their bone density holding steady? Does it start declining? We don't really know. I'm not really sure how they're going to address that in the future. And it does mean that a lot of things, because of this short duration, like if people are new to exercise, it kind of makes it hard to draw conclusions. So I actually wanted to look up body pump because it's a class that I'm really familiar with at the gym. And I found personally, after about 2 years of doing body pump, I couldn't increase the weights anymore because the reps are so high. So I stopped doing it because I could tell I wasn't going to progress. But, it made me think about it from a bone density perspective. And I found this study that found that doing body pump, which is like high rep, low weight, not going to fatigue, was effective at reducing bone loss in the lumbar spine for people that took up body pump for 6 months. So that's great. But again, it's super short. And how long does that effect last for? And the fact we can't progress weights over time, where do we stand with that? So I think I come back to those consistent theories or just those consistencies in the research and the kind of the logic behind it, that it's it makes sense that if you're contracting a muscle more when you lift heavier weights or you do something harder, it's going to cause more stimulus on the bone to then adapt and get stronger. And so applying that theory does help you choose the type of exercise you want to do in the long term. And I think the take home is that if it's sort of hard, feels hard to do it, and it keeps feeling hard over a long time, it's likely to be of benefit, albeit bearing in mind that unfortunately some things, even though they'll feel hard, they're not actually that helpful. Like I said earlier, holding a yoga pose for a longer period of time, for example, it'll feel harder and it'll probably produce some really small increase in muscle size and magnitude. Well, some type of muscle contraction, it will be different, but it's only going to be really slightly different despite feeling a lot harder for you. And so when you're looking at wanting to build muscle and bone, again, looking at whether that's an effective way to do it or not becomes more relevant. So always interventions have to be targeted to the individual. So a 75-year-old woman who's never exercised before is going to start in a completely different place to someone who's 60, who's exercising 5 times a week, who's osteoporotic. The older woman who's never exercised, you're likely to be able to pick anything and it's going to help in the early stages. Whereas the other person who's already doing heaps of exercise, you're likely to have to be a bit more specific. So bear in mind, nothing in this podcast is designed to be taken as medical advice or in place of medical advice. And if you're not sure of where to get started, please book in with one of our physios either in person or online at our website.